Hello, human geographers. We are back for our final unit before the AP exam. Tonight we begin cities and urban land use. And tonight we're largely going to be looking at the historical development of cities. But before we can do that, we have to talk about what is a city? What is urban? So let's get started. So we start with a couple definitions. Now, here's the thing about defining what is urban and what is a city. We have lots of different definitions. If you were to go through all of the approved human geography textbooks, you're going to see some common characteristics, but you're probably not going to see the same definition more than once. So we'll start with our definition, the one that we use in our class, and then we'll talk about some of the reasons why we see different things. So here is the definition. Urban, the entire built up non-rural area and its population, including the most recently constructed suburban appendages. So urban and suburban, part of the same classification. Provides a better picture of the dimensions of and population of such an area than the delimited municipality that forms its heart. If we go back to political geography, we talked about what delimitation is, okay? The fact that we're actually creating these boundaries. And so when we say urban, it does give us a better sense of, at least according to this definition, a better sense of an area than just the central city. We're going to show why. But here's the thing, with so many different, at times conflicting definitions of what is urban, how do you count up people? Because what we're going to see today is that a lot of times the population of an area that is urban depends on how the person counting that population defines urban. So if one person says, well, we're just going to focus on the city, well, then that population is going to be different than someone who is looking at all of the urban area, the built-up non-rural area, including suburban areas. And so that's why we can get some drastically different numbers, as we're going to see today and moving forward into future lectures. So keep that in mind whenever we're talking about numbers and statistics, especially statistics of population of urban areas, because those can largely depend on how one defines urban. Think of it this way. Think of, going back to unit number 1, the difference between a formal region and a perceptual region. If I said, think of the Las Vegas urban area, can you picture that in your mind? Take a moment, picture what is the Las Vegas urban area. Now, if you had to draw a boundary around that, would your boundary match up with someone else's? Not as much, because we can see it in our mind's eye. Now, there is a very formal area that is Las Vegas, but it doesn't necessarily match up with all of the built-up non-rural areas and all the suburban appendages that go with that. And so that's why defining this can be very challenging. And so we have to be aware that there are at times conflicting definitions and be ready to confront that. So in addition to that, we also talk about what a city is. All right, we mentioned that on the last slide, that urban is not necessarily just the delimited municipality, the central city that makes up the heart of an urban area. So here is city, a nucleated settlement of people and buildings clustered together to serve as a center of politics, culture, and economics. So notice some of the words that are used: nucleated, clustered, very close together, right? It's going to be important when we start talking about some of the other characteristics of an urban area. When we start talking about things like the central business district, these things are going to come back into play. Now, the legal definitions of what is a city can vary place to place, country to country. So, for example, in the United States, an area is considered a city when there are 2,500 people. United States, 2,500 people. That's considered a city. In South Africa, it's 500 people. In India, it's 5,000 people. So that is 10 times the population of what is a city in South Africa and twice the population of the United States. But it goes further than that. In India, a city is 5,000 people with an adult population that is predominantly in non-agricultural work. So working in the secondary and tertiary sectors. So it actually goes even beyond just the number of people and into, okay, well, what are those people doing as well? Because that's a part of what makes up a city, is that it's not just the number of people, it's not just the boundary, it's also what's happening there. And that's going to influence where we go in the future. Now, there are some other characteristics, other definitions of urban areas that we could use, we should certainly be familiar with. They're not definitions per se from our class vocabulary list, but they are different ways that urban areas can be defined. And so we're going to take a look at them. So we start out with a metropolitan statistical area, or MSA. And that is, in the United States, a central city of at least 50,000 people, county within which that city is located, and any adjacent counties meeting one of several tests. And typically those tests are social integration, economic integration, that could be measured by things like how many people commute to work in that city. And so you might live out in the suburbs. Those suburbs, especially when you start talking about smaller counties in the Midwest and further away, you know, it's possible that people don't even live in the county where they work, that they commute to a completely different county for work, especially to a large city. And so that's what an MSA is. 50,000 people, the county within which the city resides, and adjacent counties that are essentially tied to that city through social integration or economic integration. Another one is a micropolitan statistical area, which is basically the same thing, except that it's between 10,000 and 50,000 people. All right, 10,000 and 50,000 is a micropolitan statistical area. So just the number of people are a little bit different. Okay, everything else is the same. County within which it's found, adjacent counties to that city. All right? All right. Now, let's provide an example so that we can see how this would work. Okay, we'll look at a visual on the next slide, but let's start with this. Okay, for example, the city of Denver has between 650,000 people and 3 million people, depending on how you define the city of Denver. So we mentioned before that depending on your definition, that can affect how you count up people. Those people are there, but whether or not they're included in Denver, 650,000, just over 500,000, up to 3 million, up to 6 times as large. That's a fairly substantial difference. It's fairly substantial, okay? In addition to that, so you have the city of at least 50,000, which Denver easily meets, even by its lowest definition of 650,000, okay? The county of Denver, so the city of Denver is located in the county of Denver, and adjacent counties like Adams County, Arapahoe County, Jefferson, Douglas, that are essentially connected to the city of Denver. People will live in Adams County and commute into Denver County, and more specifically the city of Denver, in order to work. Those are part of the Denver Metropolitan Statistical Area. So let's take a look at a visual example. This is the St. Louis Metropolitan Statistical Area. So what you see up on the screen, the pink or red is the city of St. Louis. Okay, so that is the delimited municipality, to go back to our definition. All right, that is the clustered, the nucleated settlement of St. Louis. But then you can see the yellow, that is the urban area. Can we see the difference? So if you're counting up the population of St. Louis, are you just talking about within the city limits of St. Louis? Are you talking about the whole urban area of St. Louis? Because that would be a fairly substantial difference in population. So it's important, again, it helps to be able to see these things. And so I think that that would help. Now, in addition to this, the purple comprises 14 different counties that are part of the St. Louis Metropolitan Statistical Area. And so notice that these counties are not directly adjacent. They are contiguous to St. Louis County, but they're not directly adjacent. You might have 2 or 3 counties away that are contiguous to St. Louis, but not directly adjacent to it because people will commute in. And when we take a look at all those roads that are in there, all those white lines that are connecting, the city of St. Louis, very connected. It's easy for people to get into those cities. All right. Now, in addition to this, it doesn't just have to be directly adjacent. It doesn't even have to be in the same state. Notice that we have some of those counties that are part of the St. Louis Metropolitan Statistical Area that are in Illinois, and we have some that are in Missouri. And it's about being connected, functionally tied to that area. So if we were to take a look at this on a country scale, all right, so we're looking at the entire United States, but more specifically, we're looking at the county scale on this particular map because, again, when it comes to metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas, they look at the counties that are functionally tied to the city. All right. So the darker green are the MSAs, the metropolitan statistical areas. The lighter green are the micropolitan statistical areas. Collectively, all of the green, metro and micro, are referred to by the Census Bureau as core-based statistical areas. So, what I want you to do, as we often do with these maps, we identify the type of map that we're looking at, we identify the scale at which we're looking at this, but also I want you to, what are some observations that you have with this? What are some questions that you have with this? What areas have a lot of metropolitan statistical areas? What areas don't? Where does it appear a lot of people are very much connected? What areas are more disconnected, further apart? So take a moment, jot those things down. What are some of the things that catch your eye before we move on? Now, there are some other definitions, other characteristics that are often associated with urban areas. So as we go through this, let's take a look at some of these other characteristics that often are associated with cities and urban areas. So here we go. There's 6 characteristics that we're going to look at, beginning with a dense concentration of people. Folks are very, very close together. We have a lot of people and very close together. So high density, high concentration typically is associated with urban areas. And as you get out into the suburbs, you see lower densities, lower concentrations. And then that continues into rural areas where we see even fewer people, more spread out. We talked about why people are more spread out in rural areas in the agriculture unit when we talked about, beginning with the enclosure movement and the fact that, especially in the United States, the township and range system set things up for people to be further apart, more dispersed. In urban areas, very dense, very concentrated. Lots of people close together. In addition to that, these cities are distinguished by their functional complexity. All right, they're doing a lot of different things. So we're going to see industry, we're going to see services, we're going to see a lot of different services, we're going to see high-level services. And so we're going to see different things going on. And that impacts where they're going to be located. Now that's a future lecture and we'll get there. But just notice right now that cities and urban areas, there's a lot going on. We've got a lot of people doing a lot of different things, functional complexity. In addition, these cities, these urban areas, oftentimes are centers of power. Now, whether or not those are political power, because a lot of times cities are where heads of state are located. That's what we tend to see. It tends to be where governments are located, where they're situated. They could be centers of religious power, where we might see religious leaders, where we might see temples or shrines located. Because again, it's more accessible in those cities, and that's going to have an influence on what we talk about later. The centers of economics. These are where marketplaces tend to be. This is where wealthy merchants tend to locate. And so that's what we're going to see happening. The centers of education, where we see institutions of higher learning, where we see teachers and philosophers now and throughout history locating, are in cities because they are the centers of power. They're also human-created environments, and they have patterns of very specialized land use. That's going to be very, very important in this unit because one, human created is a big part of the cultural landscape, and that a lot of cityscapes, a city landscape, are very identifiable by the buildings that they have and the skylines that we see. You know, if we showed you a skyline of Las Vegas, you would be able to, it would be very recognizable because it's human created. We've created it in such a way. But also very specialized land use, which means that there's different patterns in different places in the world. So, in cities and urban land use, we talk a lot about models of land use. And so that's going to be very, very big. So we're going to see lots of different models during the course of this unit. They tend to be fairly well connected. Go back to that St. Louis example. Did you see all those roads that were connecting it? Hey, so they tend to be fairly well connected to other urban areas as well as rural areas, because a lot of times that's where the marketplace is located. So if we go back to Von Thunen, they're bringing it to the central city. They're bringing it to market. And their location relative to that market influences the crops that they're growing. So that level of connectedness is very, very important. And they tend to be contradictions. Now this one's kind of an interesting one because, for example, a lot of people move to cities with the hope of making a better life for themselves and their families. A lot of times, like if we go back in U.S. history, we've heard phrases like, the streets are paved with gold. Were they actually paved with gold? No, that wasn't literal. Hey, but it was this figurative statement that was made about cities, that it was an area to go with where you can make a life for yourself, where you can make much more money and you could support your family and things like that. But a lot of times, cities are often where we see extreme poverty, especially in the United States. And so, is that always true? If everyone comes to the city with the hope of getting a better job and a better life for their family, are there jobs for everyone? And so that's why a lot of times cities can be contradictions as well. And so we have to talk about things like site and situation that are important with regards to the location of cities. So we start with site. Remember, site is associated with the absolute location of a particular place. And sometimes cities are chosen for advantages in trade. Think coastal areas. A lot of big cities are located on coastal areas because of their access to trade. That's a site characteristic that's not very easily changed. Or defense. One good example would be the fairly mountainous terrain of Greece and the fact that Greek city-states were fairly isolated. Okay? Now, they were isolated, so on the negative side, that wasn't something that we typically see with cities, but in Greece, that also served as a defensive mechanism for them because of that very mountainous terrain of the physical geography. Could also be areas of religious practice. Think Jerusalem, think Mecca. Now, site characteristics aren't very easily changed because is it really easy to change the coastline? Is it really easy to change the mountainous terrain of Greece? Is it really easy to change the cultural significance of religious sites? Well, no, not really. Now, that's not to say that they can't change. It's just not as easily. And so we'll give another example of where it is a little bit more easy, and that is with situation. Situation is its relative location. And so cities oftentimes are chosen based on situation in a larger context, their relationship in a larger context. And that situation can change. So for example, let's give a specific example to explain how this goes. Rome, during the height of the Roman Empire, was the central city. It was the center of power of the Roman Empire. It was the head of the Roman Catholic Church. But with changes that came about, the fall of the Roman Empire, the Renaissance movement, which placed more cultural significance on areas like Florence. The Industrial Revolution, which placed more industrial importance on places like Naples, changed the situation, changed the relative location of Rome. And even now, with Vatican City, Rome isn't even the center of the Roman Catholic Church anymore. Vatican City is. And so that situation can change over time. And that's important to remember. So now that we've looked at all the different characteristics that influence what cities are, where they're located, let's take a look at the historical background of them. So we start out with the first urban revolution. So before we get started with that, let's start out with the definition of what urbanization is. It is the increase in the percentage of people who live in cities, which eventually outstrips the number of people living in rural areas. In fact, just during the 2000s, our world has gone from a predominantly rural planet to a predominantly urban planet. We have now more people living in cities than ever before in human history. And you guys were alive for that. And that's pretty neat. Now, in addition to this, urbanization is also the process of city formation and expansion. And that's the really important part for this first urban revolution. Because the first urban revolution was the process of city formation. It was the innovation of the city. It was people coming together and living in cities for the first time in human history. Then the second urban revolution is going to be that process of expansion of cities. But we'll talk about that here in a couple minutes. So when we take a look at these 5 urban herds, I want you guys to think, what else started in these exact same areas? What else started here? And we'll take a look at the map on the next slide. Mesopotamia, the Nile River Valley, the Indus River Valley, the Yellow and Yangtze River Valleys in China. Mesoamerica, so that's the Middle America, Mexico, Central America. And sometimes Peru is listed as a 6th urban herd. Sometimes you refer to it as Andean America, things like that. What else started in these same spots? Let's take a look. So we have our visual. These are the 5 herds of urbanization. Okay, we said Mesopotamia, Indus River Valley, Nile River Valley, the Yellow and Yangtze River Valleys, and Mesoamerica. So my question, what else started here? And hopefully you said agriculture. Hopefully you said, aren't these also the same herds of culture? Because they are. The same places that were the herds of agriculture were also the same herds of culture and then urbanization. So take a moment, press pause on the video. How did that happen? What is the connection between all of this? Connect agriculture, culture, and urbanization. Why did they all take place in the same spots? Because we have to be able to make that connection. We have to understand why that happened. So press pause, make that connection. That is huge. Now, as far as cities in Greece and Rome, we talked about Greek city-states before. We talked about Rome just a few minutes ago. Now, this was a secondary hearth. Okay? The concept of urbanization diffused from Mesopotamia in much the same way that agriculture diffused to Greece, Rome, Europe from Mesopotamia. In much the same way, according to the Renfrew hypothesis, the Indo-European language diffused to Europe is through agricultural technology. And with that came other things as well, like urbanization. And so Greece was a secondary hearth of urbanization. And so we talk about one of those Greek city-states, Athens, which was the first city to attain a population of 100,000 people and would eventually get up to about 250,000 people. Again, you're going to see different numbers depending on resources because those definitions of cities. But with Athens, it's fairly consistent between 100,000 and 250,000. And then later, the Roman Empire, which stretched throughout all of Europe, including North Africa and Southwest Asia. A massive empire. And we know that later, when we talk about culture, Christianity was associated with the Roman Empire. And it became later the Holy Roman Empire. But with the fall of the Roman Empire in the late 400s, urban settlements declined as well, which opened the door for other urban settlements to grow. And so when we take a look at some other areas with very large urban populations, the largest pre-Columbian city, remember the Columbian Exchange from agriculture? The Columbian Exchange was after Columbus comes to the New World. So in this case, we're talking about pre-Columbian, before Columbus comes to the New World. The largest pre-Columbian city in the Americas was Tenochtitlan, which was the heart of the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica, in what is now modern-day Mexico. And in fact, the city of Mexico City sits where Tenochtitlan was. And Tenochtitlan had roughly a population of about 100,000. Now, Athens was the first city to achieve that, but Tenochtitlan was 100,000 people. And so during that decline in urbanization that happened after the fall of the Roman Empire, other places grew quite dramatically. And take a look at the situation of this. Cities along the Silk Road that connected China with Europe. That's a situational characteristic. In West Africa, Timbuktu, which was the heart of the West African trading network. Situation. It was a center of power. It was a center of economics. It was very well connected. All those characteristics that we talked about cities before, we're seeing play out here. Now, the most populous cities in the year 900. Let's take a look at where they were. I'm going to give you the top 5 most populous cities in the year 900. We have Baghdad in what is modern-day Iraq. We have Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. We have Kyoto in Japan. We have Chang'an in China and Hangzhou in China. And so when we take a look at that, in the vacuum that was created after the decline of the Roman Empire, the largest cities were not in Europe. They were around the world. And when we take a look at these, all of them were in Asia. Iraq, Turkey, Japan, China, and China. And so we saw the growth of urban areas outside of Europe. So really the connection we're trying to make here is that while a lot of times we tend to think of MDCs in Europe and Anglo-America as being very urbanized, we want to understand that that hasn't always been the case. And really, we saw a dramatic increase in urbanization during the second urban revolution, which coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which also coincided with the second agricultural revolution. Are we starting to make some connections in how all these things are intertwined? That they don't just happen on their own out of happenstance. There's a lot of connections here. So what ended up happening is that because, and especially we'll talk mainly about Europe and specifically the UK, because the Industrial Revolution began there, where technology and energy intersected, where new technologies were able to use energy sources that were available. That freed up factories to move away from rural areas and into urban areas where they had a larger population, where they had more people, they had more workers. So when those jobs moved to cities, more and more people followed those jobs as a product of the enclosure movement, as a product of the second agricultural revolution, as a product of the industrial revolution, more technology on farms. So people are moving to cities because they lost their job on the farm. They might have lost their land with the enclosure movement. So they moved to the cities. And so as a result, cities increase in size. We see an increase in the number of factories. We see new transportation systems developed in conjunction with new technology that's coming about. We see an increase in housing as well as new housing options. For example, tenements. More and more people living closer together. Higher density, higher concentration. Again, what we associate with cities. And so we saw all of these different connections, and all of them coincided with changes in agriculture, with the enclosure movement and the second agricultural revolution. Changes with the Industrial Revolution. Changes in demography. We started seeing people living longer lives at the conclusion of the Industrial Revolution. We saw people having fewer kids as they moved to cities, and they're living closer together, and they can't have as many kids, nor do they need as many kids because they're not working on the farm, nor do they need as many workers because now they have more technology. Are we seeing how all this is connected? We want to start making those connections here. Now, last little bit for today, we're talking about urban hierarchy. All right, and the definition of that is the ranking of settlements from hamlet, village, town, city, and metropolis according to their size, economic status, and functional complexity. Remember, we said that cities are functionally complex. They have a lot of different things going on. So let's give you some characteristics of each of these different areas in terms of size and functional complexity. A hamlet is really going to be generally just a few dozen people. A few dozen people with very limited services. And hamlets tend to be more associated with like rural areas, closer to rural areas, and so we're going to see more primary sector activity rather than tertiary sector activity. Villages are going to be larger than hamlets. We're going to start to see, maybe a couple hundred people, things like that. And we're also going to see more services. It is more functionally complex. Towns range from, and this can be a big one, 50 people to a few thousand people. Whoa, that's pretty big. And so we start getting into those urban areas. We start classifying them as urban areas, but they're still smaller than cities in terms of population and area. Cities are going to typically have tens of thousands of people, very densely populated. Now, according to the Census Bureau, that's a little different definition. So again, we have to try and balance these different things. And there might not be a concrete, definitive answer to this. And that makes it really tough. A metropolis, and we go back to our metropolitan statistical area, must have over 50,000 people. A metropolis has to have more than 50,000 people. It's going to have a very large population, very large area. It's going to be centered on a city of tens of thousands of people. It's going to be very complex. It's going to have lots of different services. And the arrangement of those services we'll talk about next lecture. But it's going to be important to remember this urban hierarchy when we start talking about central place theory. And then finally, we have a megalopolis, which is one of my favorite terms for this course. A megalopolis is several metropolitan areas that are linked together. A good example of a megalopolis that we have here in the United States is the Boswash megalopolis. Boston to Washington, D.C., and that is a megalopolis. Metropolitan areas that are linked together. Go back to the metropolitan statistical area slide. When we look at all those ones across the country, take a look at that East Coast. It's almost completely contiguous. All metropolitan statistical areas linked together. That's a megalopolis. That's the Boswash megalopolis. Let's take a look. Here is the Boswash megalopolis, centered largely on Boston in the north, though it does extend a little bit further into New Hampshire, down to Washington, D.C., but further into parts of Maryland and maybe even a little northern Virginia. All right? But this is the Boswash megalopolis. Take a look at the cities that are in there. Boston, New York, New Jersey. We've got Newark right across from New York. Hey, we have Philadelphia. We have Washington, D.C. Hey, and several other very large cities in between. State capitals, centers of politics and control. All of these things are important. And so when we take a look at areas that are this, they call them emerging megaregions, but essentially what we're talking about is megalopolises. Megalopoli. I'm not sure what the plural is. I like megalopoli. These are emerging megalopoli. And so when we take a look at this, this is a graduated symbol map because the size of the circle denotes the size of the population. Take a look at areas. What are some of the things that you notice? What are some surprises? Is there anything that catches your attention? So take a moment, jot down some of those notes, quick observations. Last bit of notes here. Hey, we talk about megacities. A megacity is a city with 10 million or more residents. And we're going to take a look at this in class and go much more in depth with this. And so just remember, a megacity, more than 10 million people. A world city is one of a small number of interconnected, internationally dominant centers at the top of the global hierarchy. The examples that they give there, New York, London, Tokyo. They are not necessarily the world's biggest cities in terms of population or industrial output, but rather centers of strategic control of the world economy. So they don't always have to be big cities. New York, London, and Tokyo are fairly big cities. They don't necessarily have to be the centers of industrial output. Okay? We're not necessarily seeing a ton of secondary sector output coming from these areas. But instead, their control of the world economy is fairly significant. They have a very big impact on that. And so there is a classification system that goes with world cities. Alpha, beta, gamma. So let's take a look. We have listed there some alpha world cities. So as I go through these, what I would like you to do is maybe add another city. What's another city that you think would go in the alpha world city category? And then are there any that kind of surprise you? That you thought, well, hey, I think this would be more of an alpha world city instead of a gamma world city. You know, what are some of those things that jump out to you? So notes, observations, surprises, things like that. So we have alpha world cities, London, New York, Tokyo, that are listed in the definition. But Paris, Hong Kong, Singapore. Remember, Hong Kong and Singapore, two of our Asian tigers that we discussed last unit. Beta world cities, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, San Francisco, Moscow, Madrid, Seoul, Brussels. Gamma world cities, Boston, Buenos Aires, Istanbul, Johannesburg, Beijing, Shanghai, Rome, Prague. So again, can you add any to it? Are there any that surprise you? There's one that surprises me. I thought it would be higher. See if maybe that's the same one that surprises you. I thought Beijing would be higher. I thought Beijing would have a bigger impact on the world economy than being in the same category as Boston, below San Francisco. That was one that I was a little surprised by when I was looking at this list. But maybe there's some others that surprise you. Last slide for tonight looks at a dot distribution map of major world cities. This is looking at, we have a classification system on the left. It's a dot distribution map because it's point data. It's specific to the actual place where the city is located. But it's also a graduated symbol because the larger dots represent cities of more people. The green dots are megacities, cities of more than 10 million people. Now, when I ask you this, when you take a look at this, because we're going to use this in class much more extensively, what areas appear to be more urban based on this image? What areas appear to be less urban? And why did you characterize it that way? Was it because there were more dots? Was it because there were more big dots? Like why did you say one region was more urbanized than another? What's your explanation for it? Then, are there any things that are observations, questions, surprises, our usual things that we include on some of these maps as we examine them? So take a moment, examine this, look at it a little closely and say, okay, what do I see? What surprises me? What do I have questions about? Those types of things. And bring those to class because we're going to be using this in class next. Have a wonderful night, everybody, and I'll see you in class.